A week before Christmas, the building felt unusually quiet. Most people were already slipping into the holiday rhythm, carrying wrapped gifts and humming along to the music in the lobby. I walked in expecting a short day, nothing more than a final review before the seasonal slowdown. Instead, I was invited into a small conference room where the atmosphere felt colder than the December wind outside. The conversation was brief. They informed me that my position had been eliminated. No raised voices. No dramatic accusations. Just a scripted explanation delivered with the precision of someone who had practiced it several times in front of a mirror. I listened without interruption, already sensing that the real reason for this meeting had nothing to do with staffing adjustments. Only after the formalities did the actual purpose emerge. They wanted full access to the system I had built over years. Not a transition meeting. Not documentation. They wanted the keys immediately. The request was delivered as if I should have expected it, as if ownership were irrelevant once a contract ended. Their confidence came from a belief that technology exists without its architect. In that moment, I understood that they had miscalculated. The system was not a simple tool. It was a living structure crafted through experience, long nights, audits, and legal registrations completed quietly while others focused on promotions and presentations. The COO insisted that access was needed before lunch, convinced continuity belonged to him by authority rather than by design. I looked at him without raising my voice. I did not refuse out of anger. I refused because it was not theirs to take. The hours that followed revealed how little they understood the engine they had relied on for daily operations. The system did not simply record information. It synchronized dispatch routes, calculated timing windows, and managed inventory levels in real time. Every truck moved because a sequence of rules, checks, and automated decisions guided it across hundreds of miles. 750 vehicles depended on this invisible choreography. Over the years, I had refined its logic piece by piece. New regulations were integrated quietly. Supplier changes were adjusted without disruption. Seasonal demands were anticipated through data patterns learned slowly rather than guessed. Nothing about it was improvised, and nothing inside it existed without a deliberate purpose. Still, they believed any technician could open a manual and replicate what experience had shaped. I watched from a distance as they attempted to replace skill with confidence. They called external vendors who requested timelines and specifications that no one in the building could provide. They searched through emails hoping to find shortcuts that were never written. The architecture had been documented legally, registered properly, and protected through the contracts they had never bothered to read. What they dismissed as routine software was in fact an operational spine. Without it, deliveries stalled, compliance checks failed, and customer reports stopped generating. Every department felt the absence, even those that never knew the system existed. Leadership kept insisting that everything was under control, but the silence between their statements grew heavier. The truth was simple. They had underestimated the weight of accumulated responsibility. They had confused access with ownership. The first sign appeared in the control room shortly after my departure. A dispatcher refreshed a dashboard that normally updated every few seconds. Instead of the familiar streams of data, the screen paused, flickered, and shifted to a deep red that signaled system paralysis. At first they thought it was a routine delay, the kind that resolves itself before anyone needs to make a report. Several employees tried to restart the interface, unaware that the expiration of access had reached the core of the operations. Within minutes, routing validations began to fail. Automated paths that usually guided each vehicle froze mid-calculation. Drivers waited for instructions that never arrived. Trucks positioned across multiple regions stopped exactly where they stood, creating confusion in warehouses and transfer zones. Supervisors attempted to override the system manually, but every action led to another frozen window. Phones began to ring in patterns no one recognized. Departments contacted one another in search of explanations, each assuming the issue began elsewhere. Managers who once spoke confidently about technology found themselves asking basic questions they never imagined needing answers for. The system they had praised during quarterly meetings suddenly felt like an unmapped territory. During all of this, I was nowhere near the building. My presence had never been required for this moment. The structure I built responded exactly as it was designed to respond when unauthorized control was attempted. I understood the silence that followed because it carried the weight of realization. When the nervous system shuts down, the body does not argue. It collapses. The days that followed created a perfect storm for leadership. They had chosen the quietest week of the year to make a confident decision, unaware of the pressures waiting behind it. Most departments were operating with minimal staff. Seasonal vendors who normally provided assistance were either traveling or closing early for the holidays. External specialists who might have offered support were unavailable until the new year. Even regulators maintained their usual oversight, expecting reports that the system could no longer produce. Emails that once carried casual greetings began to shift in tone. Short requests became lengthy inquiries. Updates transformed into urgent reminders. As the situation worsened, calls replaced messages. Managers reached out in circles, attempting to gather fragments of information that never aligned. Every conversation revealed a new gap they had not anticipated. When calls no longer produced solutions, formal language appeared. Legal teams requested clarification about system ownership and responsibilities. They searched contracts, meeting notes, and archived correspondence, hoping to find a path forward that did not depend on the person they had just dismissed. Even then, no apology was offered. They were still negotiating authority as if authority could override reality. I did not rush to reply. Timing mattered more than emotion. I read each message carefully, aware that every word would shape the next step. Responses were measured, accurate, and grounded in documented facts. Panic around me was growing, but panic did not influence the truth. Urgency does not transfer ownership. Pressure inside the building reached a level the COO could no longer ignore. Departments were reporting delays, customers were escalating concerns, and drivers were calling in with incomplete instructions. Instead of slowing down to understand the real issue, he chose to act with authority rather than comprehension. He stood before his teams and announced that operations would resume shortly. He promised full restoration by the end of the day, even though he had no technical path to offer. Confidence replaced strategy and presentation replaced truth. He bypassed every internal process that existed to prevent this kind of crisis. The technical staff reminded him that they needed system access, specifications, and verified ownership before attempting a recovery. He dismissed their concerns and insisted that substitutes could rebuild whatever was needed. His conviction carried the room, but conviction without structure has a short lifespan. The board assembled for an emergency review and listened to his summary. Numbers were unclear. Timelines were inconsistent. Explanations shifted depending on who asked the question. Then a single inquiry cut through the confusion. A board member asked who owned the system that controlled the entire logistics network. The room fell completely silent. Contracts were retrieved. Legal registrations were examined. Archived correspondence resurfaced with dates and signatures that could not be debated. The system they believed the company controlled had always belonged to the person they dismissed before the holiday break. Confidence drained from the COO as documentation replaced speculation. Every assumption he had made became visible under formal review. Leadership ends when assumptions meet records. The board convened early the next morning, determined to understand the collapse that had disrupted every branch of the operation. The room was filled with executives, legal advisors, and external observers brought in to evaluate the incident. Your chair remained empty. You had not been invited, yet your presence carried more weight than anyone sitting at the table. Documents arrived in organized folders. Timelines showed when the system was created, expanded, and legally protected. Registrations confirmed ownership in clear language that had been overlooked during your dismissal. Emails from years earlier revealed that you had communicated updates, risks, and requirements long before the crisis unfolded. Every detail that had once been ignored now shaped the discussion. As the board reviewed the material, the tone shifted. Questions were no longer about restoring operations. They turned toward accountability. If leadership had known the system belonged to you, why had they acted without verification? If warnings existed, why had they been dismissed? Confidence that once defined the COO began to erode under the weight of documented truth. The meeting no longer focused on solving a technical failure. It focused on understanding how a strategic asset had been mismanaged. Liability took priority over urgency. Each board member recognized that the situation could not be repaired through quick promises or improvised solutions. You were not in the room, yet every page of the record represented you with more clarity than any speech could have offered. I did not argue my value. I had already archived it. The announcement of the COO departure arrived without ceremony. There were no speeches, no final statements, and no attempt to frame the decision as part of a long-term transition. It was delivered quietly to staff through a brief internal notice that avoided mentioning the real cause. The building absorbed the news in silence, as if everyone understood that celebration would reveal how dependent they had been on a system they never learned to respect. Interim leadership stepped in with a cautious approach. Every plan was reviewed with a level of detail that had been absent months earlier. External auditors were called to examine operational gaps and verify compliance. Meetings that once lasted minutes stretched into long sessions because they now recognized how much they had overlooked. Timelines slowed. Departments adjusted to a careful rhythm designed to prevent another collapse. The company began rebuilding the structure they had casually dismantled. They mapped the processes the system once handled automatically and studied functions they had taken for granted. Each discovery revealed how much invisible work had supported their growth. Offers were made to bring you back as a consultant. Some requests came politely, and others arrived through indirect channels, hoping for a response softened by time. You declined every invitation. You understood that returning would place you inside a structure unwilling to learn until consequences forced understanding. Distance allowed clarity. You chose it deliberately, knowing that your role in this story had already reached its natural conclusion. I did not win. I disengaged correctly. If you are over 50, you understand that experience is built quietly and tested when others least expect it. You have watched confident voices fill rooms with certainty while relying on systems they never studied. You know that preparation does not need an audience, and that steady work often carries the weight of entire departments without receiving recognition. What happened to me is not unusual. It is simply a reminder of how organizations behave when they mistake familiarity for ownership. Experience is not expensive. Ignorance is. People often discover this truth only when a crisis reveals who truly held the structure together. Never allow urgency or emotion to push you into defending what documentation already protects. When your work is built with clarity and records, it does not need a debate. It speaks long after you leave the room. Do not rush to explain what others never bothered to read. Your responsibility is to maintain accuracy, not to convince those who prefer assumption over knowledge. When you understand this, you stop chasing validation and begin choosing environments that respect contribution over performance. Never confuse salary with cost. The value of experience appears not in the moment someone pays for it, but in the moment they attempt to operate without it. That is when truth becomes visible, even to those who insisted they did not need guidance. People who fire experience before Christmas often discover in January what was truly keeping the lights on.